Hello and good evening and welcome to this evening's presidential lecture. I'm Adrian James, I'm the president of the college, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's lecturer. He's one of our most popular speakers. In fact, he's officially the most popular presidential lecturer ever, because we have 1,144 of you registered tonight, which is absolutely incredible, but no surprise at all if you've heard Femi Oyebode speak before. So he's one of our most esteemed academics, thinkers, clinicians, and managers, and he's got to the top of all of those things. So Femi was born in Lagos, Nigeria, studied medicine at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, graduating with distinction in 1977. He arrived in the UK in 1979 and trained as a psychiatrist in Newcastle upon Tyne. He's been consultant psychiatrist in Birmingham since 1986 and honorary professor of psychiatry at the University of Birmingham since 1999. And he was head of department of psychiatry in Birmingham from 2003 to 2009. He's also medical director of the trust. He's an associate editor of the British Journal of Psychiatry and on the editorial boards of the BJ Psych Bulletin and BJ Psych Advances. He was the chief examiner of the Royal College from 2002 to 2005. He's the author of Sims, Symptoms in the Mind, the 4th to the 6th editions, which has been translated into Arabic, Estonian, Italian, Korean, Mandarin, Portuguese, and Spanish. His other books include Madness and the Theatre and Psychopathology of Rare and Unusual Syndromes. He also edited Mind Readings, Literature and Psychiatry. He's a poet and a published poet and a literary critic. His volumes of poetry include Naked to Your Softness and Other Dreams, Master of the Leopard Hunt, and Adagio for Oblong Mirrors. He contributed critical essays to the Oxford Companion to 20th Century Poetry and the Oxford Companion to Modern Poetry. He received the Royal College of Psychiatrists Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016. You can see why, really, can't you? And the highest award of the Royal College, the Honorary FRC Psych in 2019. And Femi is somebody who speaks with such authority and depth. I always find that when I leave one of his talks that I feel I've gained something personally as well as professionally. So thank you to all of you who have registered. You can ask questions, you can post questions in the Q&A. Please do that throughout the course of the lecture. If you're tweeting, then please do tweet using the hashtag RCPsychLive, and you can also tag it with @RCPsych. So over to you, Femi, to give your talk on psychopathology, the foundational discipline of psychiatry.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for your kind and generous introduction. And I'm very pleased to be speaking at the President's lecture today on the subject of psychopathology, the foundational discipline of psychiatry. What I want to do is to make a few introductory remarks, and then I'll go on to say a little bit more about delusions, and then I'll find a way to draw things together. I expect to speak for about 40 minutes. And of course, some of you will know that these sort of talks that I give are at their very best when there are comments and questions, because then I can respond and say things which I haven't said in the lecture itself. I think I want to say, give my apologies to people who expect to see a PowerPoint presentation, because I've stopped using PowerPoint presentations, and I hope that you don't mind if I just speak to you directly in my usual way. So to first of all give a kind of introduction to this subject, I think it's a matter of fact that that psychiatry, that the conditions that we deal with in psychiatry, that these are conditions which are manifest in the person. So they're not like the other conditions that other doctors deal with. In other words, they are not afflictions of part organs. They're not afflictions of the thyroid, or afflictions of the spleen, or afflictions of the liver, or of muscles. These are afflictions which manifest themselves, can only become demonstrable through the person. And what I mean by that, if I may open that up a little bit more so that it's clearer, is that the disorders that we deal with at one level in some people affects the moorings of day-to-day life. So by which I mean the ability to understand clock time, ability to understand the actual physical place that one is at, and ability to understand who the other people are. Or they might affect attention. And again, and I don't mean attention in the kind of boring way that we normally think of it, but I'm talking about attention, which is what makes objects in the world luminous to us. And so the attention gives objects in the world a kind of shimmering kind of existence, so that we become aware of them and we then pay attention to them. So we attend to them. And of course, that same attention can shine a light so that our own internal thoughts or the objects of our mental state become luminous to us. And of course, the word luminous, I am not using it just to use a word that you wouldn't expect me to use in this set of circumstances. I'm using it in order to make a distinction between objects as they are in themselves without our concentrating on them, because of course they exist outside of us too. So our attention, their impairment of attention, focuses attention and brings into relief the objects in the world. And then, of course, these disorders that we deal with can also affect the capacity of the individual to model the world, and to model the world accurately in order to make judgments. And this capacity to model the world involves the ability to project oneself into the future. And such emotions as hope and time, which has helped the structure of feelings that we have, all of these are bound up with this idea that I've just expressed of this ability to model the world into the future. And then, of course, you've got the other things, like the fact that our mood gives a valence to the objects in the world that we are attending to. In other words, it prepares us to be motivated in particular kinds of ways to act towards those objects, and also prepares us to be rewarded or not by pleasure or otherwise. And then, of course, there's a whole array of other things, like the capacity of our bodies to communicate, just like I am now, by which I mean, and I'm not talking about just gestural language in a kind of mimesis way. I'm talking about gestural language, which is in its own right augments the language that we have, the capacity to use words like I am doing now, and which is one of the singular kind of extraordinary things that us humans, capacity we have to be able to communicate with other people. So what I've tried to do there is to say something about the fact that our subject is just incredible. It is incredible in the sense in which it allows us to engage with people in the totality of their person. And therefore, the idea that we might become a profession which only looks at little bits of people, as if little bits of people will speak to the wholeness of them, which obviously cannot be the case. It can't be true. So that's one. But there are issues for psychiatrists, and which we need to be aware of. So for example, we are aware that the nature of mind is in dispute, but we can, as Husserl would have said, we can bracket that and leave that to one side. And then we can start to talk about the fact that access to my mental state, to the contents of my mind, are privileged. So what I mean by that is that if I tell you that I can smell something now, or if I tell you that I can see something now, then I believe in it because it's veridical experience of mine, and I have personal, private, privileged access to it. Therefore, my attitude to my inner world is very different from my attitude to my body. So if a physician tells you that the pain you got in your abdomen is due to something called the appendix, which is in your right iliac fossa, most human beings never seen their appendix before. They have no idea what it looks like and where it is. So they receive that with a kind of sense of passivity. Whereas if a psychiatrist makes comments about subjective experiences that a person's had, the person believes themselves to be experts at their own inner life. Therefore, the psychiatrist's opinion of what is going on in inner life is contestable. So, and that's not going to change. So that's a problem that all psychiatrists have, because the nature of the experiences that people bring to us, they have private access to it. And therefore, the way in which we work with them in order to come to judgments about the nature and what they mean and signal and signify must be very different from how you would if you were dealing with physical medicine. And then I want to say a little bit about because there's a kind of preoccupation at present with objective facts, with things which have independent markers and proxy markers, and the kind of devaluation of what is subjective, as if what is subjective is somehow inferior in some sort of way. And because of that, there are problems in psychiatry in that questionnaires are becoming overvalued, and what the person says somehow is becoming undervalued. And the interaction between a psychiatrist and a patient is undervalued because it seems only to be a discourse which is over matters which are subjective. And what I want to say is that what some people call the psychopathological objects, the objects in our mind and the mental objects, they have the same degree of value as objects in the external world. I mean, all you have to do is to think of the fact that a building that we see or a bridge that we see started off as an object in someone's mind. And we're not about to say that somehow the physicality of it somehow makes, when it's built, somehow makes the mental object somehow inferior to the one that's been built. And these objects which we sometimes call delusions or hallucinations or form of thought disorder and so on. So the ability to explore in discourse with the patients the nature of these objects, their boundaries, whether they are normal, whether they are a part of a spectrum from normal to severity, whether they're distinct and qualitatively different from normal experiences. All those discussions, all those explorations, they're explorations of conceptual objects, and these objects obviously matter, because if they didn't matter, people wouldn't be distressed by them. So I want to make the point that we don't necessarily have to agree that that conceptual objects or objects in the mind are somehow inferior to physical objects in the external world. So what I want to do now is to say a little bit about psychopathology itself, and then very quickly distinguish it from nosology. And then I want to emphasize how important psychopathology is. And I want to, without saying any more about this fact, but I want to leave you with the idea that psychopathology is not dead, that it's living, and that the categories that we discuss are all the time being explored, and that the processes underneath them are all the time being explored and investigated and being clarified. And that psychopathology can't be dealt with as if it's a glossary. It can't be dealt with as if when you've written a book on schizophrenia or a book on bipolar disorder, at the end of the book, you have a glossary of terms which says what you mean by hallucination and delusions. And somehow that means that that's all you need to know about them, the definitions, all you need to know about them. So I hope I can leave you with this idea that it's a living subject. And I do that, some of you will know, by taking something which everybody agrees on. So for today's purposes, I'm going to take delusions and I'll explore it, open it up for you, give examples and show you that it's nuanced, it's complex, and there are things about it that you may not already know. So that's what I'm going to do, and then I'll try and draw things to a close. So we all know what delusions are. So the standard textbook will say that it's a false belief which is held with extraordinary conviction and which is resistant to counter-argument. And that is essentially it. And if you're working in modern society, you put something in there about social, cultural, and educational out of keeping with, because our societies are so complex and so cosmopolitan that we have to be absolutely clear that just because somebody is saying something that we don't know about doesn't mean that they're ill. So we will not put that in. And then we would say that there are primary delusions, secondary delusions, and we may also say something about overvalued ideas. And essentially, that is where we would all agree on, and that's what most people say. And what I want to suggest is that the term delusion is operating at the same level as the term in neurology of abnormal movement. And you would not think it is appropriate to call abnormal movement, to only think of abnormal movement in terms of whether it's primary or secondary. What you'll be thinking of is to give a description of the bodily movements, whether it is a ballistic movement, whether it is choreatic movement, whether it's athetotic or not, whether it is a movement where the individual is unable to move, but is complicated by tremors. So it's a paralysis agitans. So, and all of that, those terms, they're not useless terms, they're terms which speak to the origins, to the mechanism involved in producing an abnormal movement. And the same for delusions, that the delusions, they have a final common pathway, which looks as if they're all identical. But actually, our interest is try to understand the mechanism behind them so that we don't start to think that all delusions are the same. And I am not referring to the distinctions made by content. So I'm referring to the mechanisms which make these abnormal judgments occur. So what I'm going to do is take three conditions. So I'll take folie à deux, I'll take pathological jealousy, and then I'll take Capgras syndrome. And I'll use them to show that we ought to start to think about mechanisms and cognitive processes in order to come to an understanding of the mechanisms underneath these conditions. So we all know what folie à deux is. It's nothing clever at all about it. It just is simply saying that you've got a person who you know is a primary case, who has delusional beliefs, and that these delusional beliefs, they are as we expect them to be, that the person holds them, they're false, they hold them with conviction, and they're recalcitrant to counter-argument. And then we have a secondary case. And the secondary case too holds the abnormal beliefs in exactly the same way we would expect them to hold it, given that we regard them as delusions. But our view is that they have that belief precisely because they're having a close relationship with a person who is the primary case. And folie à deux is much, much more complicated than people think. So what I mean by that is, of course, the relationship matters. So sometimes you have sisters, sometimes you have twins, sometimes you have a mother and her children, sometimes you have a couple. So the point I'm trying to make there is that, of course, when they're twins, for example, and one of them has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the likelihood of the other also being ill raises the possibility that it's just by random chance that they're both ill at the same time and are having very similar delusional beliefs. So it's not as simple as you would normally expect. But nonetheless, the original description by Lassergue and Faure in 1877, and they give this description, which stands till today, of what they expect the conditions should be that are necessary for folie à deux, or folie à trois, or folie à quatre, or folie à famille to occur. And they say an active individual who is more intelligent than the secondary case, where the secondary individual is passive initially and resists the new belief and modifies and corrects it to make common cause, and they must be living in a close-knit living arrangement, and that the belief must be within the limits of what is possible. Now, I've chosen to use folie à deux to start with because it's the easiest to talk about, and also because it is the ways in which a belief, an abnormal belief, is induced in another person, and that the strange thing is that in psychiatry we make no reference to the fact that the systems, the cognitive systems that are involved are exactly the same cognitive systems that are involved in us taking on beliefs. And we know a lot about the social psychology of persuasive communication. We know the factors which are associated with persuasive communication. And if persuasive communication didn't work, none of us will go and buy particular kinds of toothpaste or particular kinds of toothbrushes or whatever, because persuasive communication is the same stuff which is used by PR, by public relations people. They are the same stuff that is used in adverts to alter our belief systems and to change our attitudes. And it's the same stuff that you use in health education promotions. What is strange is that we talk about folie à deux in isolation from the other things that are going on, which actually are built on the same sort of infrastructure. And of course, we talk in folie à deux about the fact that separation makes a difference, but it doesn't always make a difference. So the persuasive communication, which works to produce a particular belief in the context of folie à deux, is the same cognitive processes that works in our situation. Indeed, it works in our situation for people who hold prejudicial views. It works in our situation for people who hold particular political views. It works in our situation for people who hold religious views. So it is essentially everywhere. So that if you are really committed to understanding folie à deux, we ought not just to be thinking whether it's a primary or a secondary delusion and so on and so forth. We should be asking the question, what are the processes that make the psychological and cognitive processes that make belief systems be communicable to another person? And the abnormal belief is only a special case of the same situation. And that will have very little to do with other kinds of delusions. So that's the first thing to say. And obviously I'll be happy to have discussion about that. And then I want to take pathological jealousy. And pathological jealousy is precisely what it says it is. It's a situation where an individual is jealous of the relationship between two other people. So it's probably helpful to just remind myself that an important distinction to be made is the distinction between envy and jealousy, because in ordinary language, people misuse and conflate both emotions. So envy is an emotion which arises in the context of two people, and it's to do with the feelings of one person about the characteristics or features of another person or attributes of another person, whereas jealousy is a feeling which occurs in the context of at least three people, and it is one person having particular kinds of feelings about the relationship of the two others. So they're very, very different, conceptually different feelings. And sometimes to help for people to remind people so that they're properly aware and not, they don't have to go and look in a book. If you think of the Oresteia, and the Oresteia is wonderful because you have the classical Greek tragedy. You got Agamemnon, who's the general of the Greeks as they're about to go into war with the Trojans, and you got his wife Clytemnestra, who is Helen of Troy's sister, who envies Helen of Troy's beauty because Helen of Troy is regarded as thought of as the most beautiful woman in the classical period, and her husband, therefore Clytemnestra's husband, is about to go to war, but the Greek boats are stuck at the ports because the winds fail. And then the oracle says that Clytemnestra's daughter, Iphigenia, has to be sacrificed. So you can see the feeling of anger because her own daughter has to be sacrificed in order for her husband to go and help to rescue Helen, who's thought to be abducted. And then at the end of the war, Agamemnon comes back with Cassandra, who is a young, beautiful princess who is one of the spoils of war. So that story, it allows us to think of the nature of envy that Clytemnestra has for her sister's beauty, and also it tells us something about the nature of of jealousy, which she has for the new relationship between her husband and Cassandra. So I tell that in order to just to fixate these ideas so we are properly aware of what the issues are. But the point I want to make, my task is not to do a big or long exposition on the nature of pathological jealousy. The point I want to make is that the behaviors which occur in the context of pathological jealousy, those behaviors, they're behaviors which are understandable, totally understandable in the context of evolutionary biology. So we know quite a lot about how animals behave in relation to progeny. So we know, for example, before we start to talk about humans, so we know, for example, that spiders are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to ensure that the female spider only carries a fetus, which is that of the male who is just impregnated her. So he snaps off his penis and leaves it as a plug. And we know that rodents, male rodents, have pheromones which induces abortion in females that they're just about to have sex with. So we know that there's a lot of activities in the animal kingdom to essentially to secure the not exclusive sexual access, but to ensure that progeny is that of the person who is the prime mover, as I've just described. So the behaviors that we're discussing in jealousy, so that if you always think of jealousy as occurring, as having emotions, it has cognitions, and it also has behaviors. And Margot Wilson's idea, which I totally agree with, is that these behaviors are just the human equivalent analogs of the behaviors which I've just described, which we know occur in other animals. So these behaviors of feeling that you're under threat because your partner is about to have sexual intercourse with somebody else, the idea to try to guard sexual exclusivity, the idea to ensure the paternity is yours and not someone else's, and so on. So these behaviors, which arose in the ancestral period, that these behaviors are what we now call jealousy, and that we know what the purposes of it are. And that you can do work on it very simply. So, for example, we know that the vast majority of the domestic abuse in this country and in other parts of the world is practically down to jealousy. We know that quite a substantial number or proportion of murders of women is down to jealous spouses. And we also understand very clearly, so if you were to look at the killing of children, wonderfully shown, demonstrated by Margot Wilson and her colleague Darley, that these are practically almost always stepchildren, mimicking exactly what you expect to find, because that's exactly what the lions do. So the point I'm making, therefore, is that pathological jealousy, very different from folie à deux, is sitting on a brain module, brain systems, which are to do with what we've just been describing. And that these systems, they are systems which everybody understands. But of course, when the person who we're seeing is ill, they're carrying it to an extreme compared to the feelings that other people have. But the point I am making is that that belief, which by all accounts is delusional in the cases where the delusional jealousy, is much more comprehensible once you've understood the background, the evolutionary background of it, and that it shares commonality with the experiences that all the normal people have. And that is totally different from the mechanisms that produce folie à deux. And finally, I want to turn to delusional misidentification syndromes. And I want to use delusional misidentification syndromes to talk about, because we know quite a lot about it, so to talk about cognitive processes which underpin delusional beliefs. and that these ones are different from the two that I've already discussed, and that they are far much more profitable for us to think about in the way in which I'm suggesting we think about them, rather than just be thinking about primary or secondary or overvalued ideas. So you will all know that delusional misidentification syndromes comprise, in general for today's purposes, comprise Capgras syndrome, Fregoli syndrome, syndrome of intermetamorphosis, reduplicative paramnesia, and syndrome of subjective doubles. But I just want to focus for today's purposes, just focus a bit on Capgras. So Capgras, as you know, is where an individual believes that somebody who's familiar has been replaced by an imposter. And essentially what the patient will say is that even though this person has all the physical characteristics of my dad or my spouse or my mother, I know that it's not my mother. And if you were to be properly interested in these conditions, they will tell you that either something to do with their gait, or something to do with how they sit, or something to do with their voice, or something to do with how they shake your hand, tells them that they're not the right person. Now, these conditions are of interest to us because they are not identical, but they are similar to prosopagnosia, which of course is a neurological condition. So in prosopagnosia, the individual is unable to recognize their familiar people by sight. So they can't tell you. You can show them photos of all their relatives and they can't tell you, who they are. They can't identify them. But of course, neurology is always different from psychiatry. So in neurology, that will be a condition which is permanent, which is unvarying, and it will be inability to recognize all relatives, all familiar people. It won't be just one or two of them. Whereas in psychiatry, Capgras is generally speaking transient, because when the primary condition disappears, then the experience itself goes away, and then it doesn't occur across the board. So it's not saying all my relatives have been replaced, it's only one or two of them, and so on. And sometimes it's not even relatives, it's their doctor or their nurse or something of that sort. So neurology is always different from psychiatry. But for the first time, it did look as if we might be able to track down what the difficulties are in a psychiatric condition. So that's the reason for interest in delusional misidentification syndromes. And then Bauer, who's a psychologist, showed that in prosopagnosia, that even though these patients could not identify their familiar persons, their relatives, just by looking at them or looking at their photos, if he wired them on to a skin galvanic response, autonomically they were able to recognize them. So Bauer had that absolutely beautiful idea that there are at least two recognition systems, pathways, one which is autonomic and the other which is iconic. So that's a beautiful discovery. And then our colleagues in Ellis and Young, who were psychologists at the time working, I think they were working in Wales at the time, then applied that. They applied that to delusional misidentification syndromes. So they proposed that in delusional misidentification in Capgras, what you have is that the iconic recognition is there. So you look at the dad, your dad, and you recognize that it is your dad, but that the fellow feeling, the warmth, and the kind of autonomic response is missing. And that's a wonderful thing to recognize, to suddenly realize that we can start to understand how somebody comes to hold a belief based on face processing anomalies, and that the face processing anomalies are demonstrable. And that shares nothing. The face processing is obviously what we all have, but the experience has nothing in common with what other people have. So that is, and tells us something about where we ought to be looking for changes. It tells us something about the fact that we should be looking at the lingual gyrus, and it tells us something about the fact that if we look at Sean Lewis's work, it tells us that we should be looking at the frontal lobe as well, because it's not just that you have difficulties in the occipital cortex, but you have to have difficulty in the frontal lobes in order to come to erroneous judgments. So that is an example of a delusion where we can track it down to start to think about what the mechanisms are, what the processes are that underpin it. So to summarize what I think I've done so far, what I've done is I've hinted that instead of using a kind of language about delusions, which is stuck in 1913, which is stuck in Jasper's day of primary and secondary and overvalued ideas, that it's time to start to think that these terms, that there's a different way of approaching them, which shows us something about what the processes are that underpin them. And that once we know that, then the shape of these delusional beliefs starts to take a different kind of, it has a different kind of approach to thinking about them. So that's what I think I've done. Now, just to confirm, because I don't want people to think that this way of thinking about psychopathology only pertains to delusions. So the same sort of work which I've been doing over the last 35 minutes or so is you can do it for hallucinations. So you take something as well accepted as auditory verbal hallucinations, and you can start to ask the question about auditory verbal hallucinations, whether all auditory verbal hallucinations are the same. And of course, at the superficial level, we know they're not all the same. So you've got third person auditory hallucinations. So you can then ask the question, the third person auditory hallucinations, why do they come? How do they come? Why is it in that structure? Because whatever language you speak, and I've practiced psychiatry in Nigeria, whatever language you speak, it is still the same structure. So it's not arbitrary. And then you've got command hallucinations. And then you can start to do a little bit of work to make distinctions between private speech and internal speech. And private speech has a form which is very, very similar to command hallucinations. And therefore, if you're a neuroimager and you're imaging auditory hallucinations, and you haven't yet established that there are different kinds of auditory hallucinations, and then you're surprised that you can't find consistent findings. So the point I'm making there is that there's work to be done. And secondly, with hallucinations, that we act as if the prototype, this is would be misled a little bit by Carl Jaspers, that the prototype for understanding hallucinations is visual, but we rarely see visual cases. And not only is it that we rarely see visual cases, but that the quality and the features and the characteristics and the formal characteristics of different kinds of hallucinations are completely different. So for example, if you were just to think of an olfactory hallucination, the distances which the smell travels completely different from the distances which vision travels. And the persistence over time of the event, they're different. So if you're listening to me, the minute you hear me, what I've said just disappears. Whereas there's a different persistence if you were thinking of smells. And again, a completely different persistence if you're thinking of vision. And nobody seems to spend time to pay attention to that with a view to thinking of the different modalities, how the different modalities operate in the real world, what implications that has for how we name them, and so on. So to draw it to a close, what I hope I've done is to show that that psychopathology is important, that it is alive, that it is not a glossary, and that you couldn't have nosology, you couldn't have diseases without understanding psychopathology, because in order to have a category at the level of disease, you have to find a way to bring together the kinds of psychopathology that is underpinning it. Therefore, you can't just treat it as if it were a glossary at the back of the book. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be delighted to respond to questions and queries.
Well, Femi, thank you so much for that. Fantastic talk, deep, revealing and compelling all at the same time. And it's clear that everybody thinks this. The comments in the chat, we've got a global audience. I can certainly see people from Myanmar, from India, from Portugal, from New Zealand. Apologies about the time difference there. But thank you for joining us. That's absolutely fantastic. I'm going to go straight to the questions. We've got some great questions. So first of all, from Rafiq Memon, I remember a lawyer asking if the mental state examination is subjective or objective. I said it's both. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's a very, very difficult question you've asked me, and it forces me to talk a little bit about subjectivity. You know that, because of course when you raise it like that, it's as if we are having a discussion over relative merits, and I'm so fully conscious of the idea that the subjective is regarded as something which is inferior, and I want to defend the subjective very, very much. And then I want to go back and you know, if you read your Carl Jaspers, and Carl Jaspers talks about performances, and when he talks about performances, what he means are objective facts. So essentially he's talking about memory tests and visible behaviors. So if somebody's agitated, they are agitated. So those are objective facts. And if somebody has abnormal movements, then they do have it. But that, in my view, it's inescapable that in order to understand the content of somebody's mind, you have to talk to them. Therefore, there's something occurring in discourse. And I use the term discourse because it's not the same. It's not the same as a questionnaire. So it's important to hang on to that it's not the same as a questionnaire. And forgive me for those of you who are listening who are not don't live in the UK, but our Prime Minister was grilled yesterday in Select Committee. Now, they could have sent him a questionnaire, and his answers would have been, even if they were the same, there's something lost in translation. So discourse is what I mean, that there's something about two human beings engaging. There's something about how the person speaks, how they hold their body, how they look, and believe it or not, and I said a little bit about attention earlier, that part of the task of attention is to measure the duration between me asking you a question and you answering it. And that duration tells me a lot, and all that processing is happening automatically. So I agree with you, there are aspects of mental state examination which are objective in the usual way of thinking of objective, but a large proportion of it is subjective, but that is no less useful or important.
Okay, that's great. That's very, very clear. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that we had in advance. So a question from David Veal. How does the discipline of psychopathology keep up with our progress in our psychological understanding of mental disorders? There are many cognitive processes, for example, rumination, comparing and ranking oneself, being excessively self-focused, trying to suppress or neutralize an unacceptable thought. These are important in a psychological understanding of many disorders, but are not part of the current discipline.
So, David, thank you very much for your question. I take your point, and I do totally agree with you. But let's take an example from your own work. So David Veal's worked on body dysmorphic disorders, and he's done incredible work looking at whether or not body dysmorphic disorders is actually an abnormality, arises as a result of an abnormality of aesthetic perception. Now, aesthetic perception actually sits underneath a lot of conditions that we psychiatrists see. So, for example, we know that it's important, symmetry is important. We don't know exactly why symmetry is important for human beings. There's some notion that symmetry is important for human beings because in the ancestral period, only living things were symmetrical. Of course, that's no longer true. so that we're using the yardstick of symmetry as a way of understanding whether something's alive or not. But we do know it's important. So, and symmetry, abnormalities of symmetry perception is fundamental to Gilles de la Tourette. It's fundamental to obsessive compulsive disorder. It informs some of the things that are happening in patients who have body dysmorphic disorder. But there's also, so that's just looking at symmetry. But of course, you could also look at form, which is completely different from symmetry. So the point I'm making, I agree with David Veal. I mean, I couldn't agree more. But I'm making the point that it's not ignored.
Okay, that's great. A bit of a challenge here from Aofi Hunt. So given that we now have fairly precise neuroimaging, syphilis has been eliminated, other biological causes of psychosis have been cured, hypothyroidism, is psychopathology, like Freud's examination of dreams, a useful tool in its day, but now outmoded?
I mean, I take the point that's being made, but I don't agree with it, of course. But first of all, let's clarify our levels of discussion, conceptual levels of discussion. So because we're moving from disease to discussion about syphilis, and that's a disease level discussion. I've not discussed nosology. I'm not preoccupied with whether schizophrenia really does or doesn't exist. So I'm discussing fundamental, elemental abnormalities, subjective abnormalities. I call them elemental because they are like the periodic table. They speak to the infrastructure, both of normal people, but also of abnormal experiences. So that's where we are. Now you can't do anything. It's a forlorn hope that you could do without psychopathology, because it'd be like saying you're going to do without a neurological examination and just put somebody in a scan. So it is foundational. But of course, for all other reasons, and it's not like dreams. So it is as the examination of the inner life in this context is as forensic as any other examination there is. And you've got to be pretty good at doing it properly.
So related to that, a question from Dr. Simmons. I'm pleased to hear that psychopathology is still regarded as our foundational discipline. Psychopathology is the result of an investigative process, phenomenology. Are today's trainees being actively taught phenomenology?
I hope I teach it in Birmingham, so I hope they're being taught it. I think that there's a tendency at present not to be to want to downgrade it, which is my concern, which I've been expressing all afternoon, that people want to turn it into a glossary, which I don't think. It's not a glossary. And I think it's embedded in the college. I haven't looked at the college curriculum, but definitely when I was chief examiner, it was embedded in college curriculum. So I expect it's still there. Whether or not you've got people who live and breathe it, teaching it is another matter. And there are not very many people in Western Europe, for example, we meet once a year. Those of us who regard ourselves as psychopathologists, and at the very most we have 15 people, but often we're between 8 and 10 of us. So there are not very many people who are spending a lot of their time just thinking about this. So there could be many, many more of us.
Okay, that's great. Something I need to look into and make sure that we are doing all we can. So I'm going to combine two questions here, I think on a similar sort of theme. The first is about overvalued ideas. So the concept of overvalued ideas is difficult in clinical practice. McKenna's article expanding on Wernicke's work is already dated, and many conditions in that paper are now called delusions. So with delusions increasingly seen on a spectrum, is there any need for the concept of overvalued ideas? And they say, I have anorexia nervosa in mind when I ask this question. I'm going to combine it. It's not exactly the same, but what is your view on pseudo hallucinations, which may conflate with hallucinations? So
Yes.
overvalued ideas and pseudo hallucinations.
Yeah. Well, we've chosen, haven't we? We've chosen two of the most complex and contestable phenomena, haven't we? So I do agree that overvalued ideas is complicated and misunderstood. But there's good reason to hang on to it as an idea. So if I haven't read Peter's paper recently, so I can't recall what's in it. But if I just say what I think overvalued idea is, overvalued idea is no different from a delusion with respect to the degree to which it's held with conviction. So it is recalcitrant to counter-argument, just as delusions are. And it also motivates behavior, actually probably even more so, because it is full of passion in it. So the only difference is that it is understandable, it's comprehensible. And if you remember, we never say this often enough, but a primary delusion, or what Jaspers would have called a delusion proper, is not comprehensible. He would have said his term in the English translation is ununderstandable. So that's the difference between them. But you need to populate that, what I've just said, with examples in order to make it come alive so that people really understand what an overvalued idea is. So an overvalued idea, my personal example is a young man who presented, he must have been about 25 or 26 years of age, presented with delusional jealousy, believed that his wife, who he just recently married, was having an affair. But when you took a history, you discover that when he was a boy, his mother was having an affair and used to take her son with her to see her lover, because that way her husband wouldn't know that he wouldn't believe that she would have taken her son. Therefore, this boy grew up thinking that it is likely, if not always the case, that your spouse might cheat on you. So he held the view that his wife, for no good reason, because they had no reason for it, that she was having an affair, but she wasn't. But it's understandable. So that makes it an overvalued idea, because it arises comprehensibly out of a history that we could take. So that's the distinction between them. Now, the reason why I say it's important to keep the idea, is that the closer a belief is to a normal way of arriving at a judgment, the harder it is to treat. Therefore, it's important to hang on to it because it gives you an inside understanding of the way in which it's arisen. So that's to do with that. And pseudo hallucinations, as you all know, is very complicated, which is a funny word. You shouldn't really call it pseudo, because when you use the word pseudo, it means it's false, it means the person is pretending, whereas it's just a descriptive term. That's all it is, that's a descriptive term. It's not a term that says you shouldn't listen to the patient. It's not a term that says you dismiss them. It's not a term that says you discharge them. Because if somebody has a content of hallucination, which is, it says they're going to stab or kill somebody, or they've been told they're going to kill somebody, the fact that it's a pseudo hallucination, quotation marks, doesn't mean you not pay attention, doesn't make it any less dangerous. Therefore, for as long as you know that we're unlucky that we've got that word pseudo, for as long as you know that making a pseudo is just an attempt to distinguish it from a true hallucination. And that's all we're discussing, that we're trying to distinguish it from a true hallucination. And again, with the word true hallucination, it implies that something which is not a true hallucination is somehow inferior. So language is problematic there, I think. But please, whether it's a true or a pseudo hallucination, you're still interested in it, properly speaking.
Okay, two big questions there and two big answers. So interesting question from William Calthorpe. So lots of people seem to be taking on unusual beliefs in online communities. Is this a modern folie à deux?
Well, yes, because I haven't studied it, I don't know. I mean, I think folie à deux is more common than we think. So I'll certainly say that. And I think and even where it crosses over into violent behavior, we still don't recognize that it's a folie à deux. Forensic psychiatry colleagues might do every so often. So every time you see a news item where a child's been starved or a child's been tortured, and both parents are in on it, and they are behaving as if there's a real fact that this child is a devil or Satan or a demon or something of that sort. They're really, and there's literature on it, there's really good evidence that what's going on there is what we would normally call folie à deux, but they never turn up to see us. They're turning up in a different kind of set of circumstances. So folie à deux is commoner than we believe. And so for me, to know whether what's going on online is close to folie à deux, my view would be just like Foley. My view would be that these particular kinds of conditions are met. So if you think of persuasive communication, what you do is you're looking at who is given the message, you look at who is receiving the message, and you also look at the content, what the message is. So classically speaking, when you're thinking of an advert, you're using an authority figure, which is why the dentists on the TV are in their white coats. And sad to say, the person's got to be attractive. All the evidence says they've got to be attractive. And then the content, what they say, has to be believable. So they can't say something, they can gradually change it to become very extreme at some point, but initially it has to be believable. And then the people who are in receipt of the information must be wanting it. There must be a need in them for it. So if those conditions are met in the kind of examples you're giving about what goes on online, then I think somebody needs to do the work, and we have to start to consider that that's what's happening.
Okay, that's great. Just a fairly straightforward question. How long did it take you to write Sims' Symptoms Descriptive Psychopathology?
Andrew Sims wrote Sims. He did the first three editions, and then I took over to do the fourth, and then I've done the fifth and the sixth, and then just finished the seventh, which will probably come out sometime next year. So it takes to do the revisions takes about 18 months. So I don't know how long it took Andrew to do the first edition.
And our final question, actually, no, we have two more questions. This is an interesting one, actually. In relation to this, any thoughts on the pros and cons of virtual or online interviewing of patients in psychiatry? Has the online interview changed all of this in any clear way?
I'm not sure that it has. I mean, I'm now retired, but I did work between March 2020 and July of this year. So I experienced about 18 months of working online. And the main thing that I was struck with, that the relationship was more equal, because I was doing my clinics in exactly the same position that I'm in, and people could see into my study. And that changed the interaction with me. So, and that's not psychopathology. They just changed how they spoke to me. And they asked me in a very pointed way how I was. And I behaved as if I was still in hospital with them there. And I said, oh, I'm all right. They said, no, I don't mean that. I mean, how are you? So there was something which was a kind of more democratic kind of interaction between us. It would have been better to have the people I saw for the first time face to face. Because as I hinted earlier, there's so much more that goes on. You've got the three-dimensional aspect of it, that you're able to see people better. You can look at their eyes, and to come back a bit to what I've already spoken about delusional misidentification syndrome. We know that there are brain modules whose whole purpose is to look at the direction of gaze, and there are other brain modules whose whole purpose in life is to look at the direction of profile. And that when there's a discrepancy between gaze and profile, the brain, becomes very sharp, because it's starting to worry whether the person is lying or whether they're shifty or something of that sort. So those sorts of level of unconscious but very automatic kind of processing, you miss that when you're working online. So I think my preference would be to be working face to face with human beings.
Well, Femi, I think we are going to have to finish there. Unfortunately, that was just an absolutely fantastic lecture, and the I think just the quality of the questions that have come reflect the interest in what you have to say and in this subject. And thank you so much for answering the questions so comprehensively. I've chaired a lot of these meetings. I've never seen so much in the chat. I hope that we can save that. There was so many people saying, fantastic to see you, what a great lecture. Thank you for adding clarity where often there is none. So thank you so much. And there are also 44 questions in the Q&A. So I think we could probably go on till about 10 o'clock at night, but sadly we are going to have to finish there. A really big thank you from the college and from myself, Femi. We're clearly going to have to get you back. Our audience demands it. And so just to say, there's been questions about the is the talk going to be available? It will be on the website, so you can watch it again, and we'll look at the questions as well. There's also a feedback form. If you can give us some feedback, that would be absolutely fantastic. I can well imagine what the feedback is going to say. So Femi, thank you again. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for those who've asked questions. And thank you to the team at the Royal College for all the support that you've given, in particularly Isabel, Thomas, Leah, and Peter, and the whole of the team. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening wherever you are in the world. In fact, it might be the rest of your morning. So thank you, and goodbye.